kind of from where we left off, we're still in Jeremiah. The text today is Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 29 through 34. And then at the end, there's an insert from John chapter 1, verse 17. So I'll read the text first, and then we'll go through it. But the first part is Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 29 through 34. It starts, in those days, people will no longer say, the parents have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. Instead, everyone will die for their own sin. Whoever eats sour grapes, their own teeth will be set on edge. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or one to say to another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness, and I will remember their sins no more. And then John chapter 1:17 says, for the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. The introduction, it says better than before. It says, moving into a house with no built-in dishwasher, my father bought a used portable model, the kind that hooks up to the sink faucet with a hose. It was in good shape except for the top, a butcher block deeply scratched and stained. Dad decided to make it like new. It took him many months. Night after night, he would go to our carport to sand it by hand. Excuse me. He must have sanded a half inch off the top of that butcher block to get past the deepest gouges. When he was finally satisfied, he began to apply varnish. He would apply a coat, then sand it, and repeat. He must have applied 30 coats of varnish to that wood. When he was finished, it was clean and scratch-free, even better than new. The old butcher block was given a new life. A vital theme of the Bible is the need and plan for a new covenant, a fresh beginning for God's people. The gouges of sin were deep and a thorough refresh was in order. Jeremiah was privileged to prophesy the future reality of that new covenant that we are privileged to experience it. And that's what today's text is completely derived from. It's talking about what was old and what will be new. And the lesson context is the book of Jeremiah serves more as a collection of episodes rather than a linear chronology of his ministry. For example, the episode that begins in Jeremiah 32:1 occurs after the one that begins in chapter 36. So anybody that's ever done the Bible in chronological order, you know that there's some pieces that it takes you a minute. When you read, it's actually the next chapter, but it's referencing something from the chapter before. So it all fits together in a perfect way, but it's not necessarily in a linear order. It says, therefore, we should not be surprised when tone and content change abruptly as the book moves from topic to topic. We see such an abrupt change as chapter 30 begins. The way Jeremiah organized his material has led some to call Jeremiah 30 through 33 the book of consolation, because its theme gives hope that the Babylonian captivity is not the final word. Today's text takes us into the vital heart of this book. As we consider our text, keep in mind how it fits within the larger context. God promised to make the exiles his people once again, to return them to their land, and to establish once and for all time the Davidic dynasty as originally promised. The overall theme of the book of consolation is, I will restore their fortunes. The covenant theme of, you will be my people and I will be your God, is also repeated. The seemingly incurable wound could be healed only by the Lord. Chapter 31 depicts the coming restoration as a time of great blessing, when mourning would be turned into joy. And we'll go right into it. Verse 29. In those days, people will no longer say, the parents have eaten sour grapes and children's teeth are set on edge. So the sour grapes parable is an old parable. It's an old proverb. And it's referenced by those who are already in captivity, and they're kind of looking at the place that they're in, and they're thinking how they got there. And of course, they're blaming it on their parents, which is accurate to a degree. And the tie-in to sour grapes, Jamie can speak to, since it's a teeth analogy, we'll go to the expert. But if you eat grapes over and over and over again with that acidic content and there's no cleansing, they're going to be coming in to see y'all, right? Correct. So if you eat grapes, brush your teeth. But it says the intent of this proverb's misuse is impossible to miss. Eating a sour grape is unpleasant. It causes the mouth to pucker. This puckering effect is transferred from the older generation who have eaten unwisely to the following generation, who are seen as innocent victims of their ancestors' actions. Thus, we have a metaphor for generational blame shifting. And that's kind of how it got. Yeah, I think back to, I think it was my lesson the last time where it talked about Josiah when he received the word. There was immediate, there was immediate sorrow, and we got to make this right. And you don't see that here. They look at the plight that they're in, and it's immediately, well, it's my parents' fault. They didn't follow the law. Now look, I'm in exile. So you see, that kind of generational shift. It says the proverbial expression is actually based in the law of Moses, where God is seen to punish the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. Today, we readily observe the intergenerational consequences of parents who were sent to jail for committing crimes. Children often do suffer as a result of the sins of their fathers, but the fact that the sins of one generation have consequences for another is not the same thing as saying that God punishes an innocent group for the sins of a guilty group. And we'll get into ownership of sin later in this verse, in this context. But I mean, that's really the truth. You can kind of put yourself in a bad situation based on your parents' actions. But at the end of the day, we all own our own sin. We all hold the accountability to ourselves. It says the problem in today's text is that when exile comes, the people will apply the proverb to disavow any culpability for their situation. Indeed, that was already happening by those who were already in exile. Chapter 30. Instead, everyone will die for their own sin. Whoever eats sour grapes, their own teeth will be set on edge. So this is not, when you read that, it sounds kind of harsh, that everyone will die for their own sin. And that's not really what it's talking about. It's not a threat. This is more of a prelude to what grace will be. And one of the tie-ins that I saw when I was looking at other commentary for this specific verse, it talked about the prodigal son, and you think about he went out, he obviously committed sin, lived a life of sin, but he owned it. He owned his own sin, and at the end, his father gave him grace. And that's kind of what this verse is a prelude to, is that everyone is accountable for their own actions, but the grace will be available to everybody. Verse 31, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. Excuse me. When you read this, it's easy, and you see skeptics do this a lot, when you talk about Old Covenant and New Covenant, and it's almost like they make it seem that the first covenant didn't work. And I guess you could say that to a degree, but that's not God. That's not, God is not me sitting in my office punching code and, oh, that one didn't work. Let me try this one. It's all part of the same blueprint. The Old Testament, the Old Covenant was the foundation. And from that, you build the rest of the house. The New Covenant is the finished product, but it all works off the same blueprint. And this blueprint, was his blueprint. It talks about, again, it references the days are coming, declares the Lord. And that was always a way that kind of they led into prophecy. And it says, but when was this to occur? And it says, when will the days come? Although Jeremiah speaks of Israel and Judah, additional context in subsequent verses and later fulfillment establish that this comes with the life, death, and resurrection and ascension of Jesus Christ. So it's easy for them to get lost in the now in their situation. But this refers to, the coming of Christ. This refers to the future. Verse 32, it will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. The spousal metaphor here, I think when you look at it from that sense, is appropriate, because you look back to when they were led out of Egypt, and he did lead them by the hand, and he was faithful, and, you look at what they did in return, and you can kind of compare that to a dysfunctional marriage in a way. I found some additional commentary on verse 32 that wasn't in here, but it talks about it highlights our human shortfalls over time. And when you relate that to a marriage, in today's society, well, they're headed for a divorce, but did God divorce? He didn't. Instead, it was a renewal of vows almost. It was the covenant was renewed. So he didn't turn his back. And he had, if you compare it to that situation, he would have had every reason to. Verse 33, this is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. It says, the old covenant is written on stone, and the people of its era were to internalize its laws. The new covenant, by contrast, is written on minds and hearts by God himself. It is through the Holy Spirit who indwells each and every Christian that God does so. Obedience will not depend merely on human ability. Rather, God's people will exhibit spirit-empowered, loving obedience to his ways, which will flow from the inside out. The thing I took from that was it's not a tablet. It's built inside of each and every person. And it's obedience out of love, not out of fear. And you think about that. I always think, I remember Papa telling me that his managerial style was, if you're a slave driver, people will give you what you ask them to do, and that's it. But if they want to go that extra mile for you, they will go that extra mile for you. And that's the way we worship. We worship out of love, not out of fear. Because at the end of the day, you will go that extra mile when you feel that. And the way it talks about with it written, it talks about law is written, and it's more instruction. When that's written within each and every person, it's a built-in GPS. You'll make that, if you're centered correctly, you'll make the turn that you're supposed to make without knowing that you make it. That's what that is, versus having to reference something external and material like a stone tablet. Verse 34. Hang on, let me read this insert first. It's called Action from the Heart. It says, my mother grew up Roman Catholic, but claims she came to true faith as an adult in a Protestant church setting. There she finally understood God's grace. As a child, I took her story to heart and incidentally inherited a distaste for anything rote or ritualistic. Faith was supposed to be lively and from the heart. Little did I know that I would one day belong to a church where liturgy is central. The liturgy I participate in week after week is not rote, quite the opposite. Our church family experiences what some might call rules and rituals as life-giving and grounding. They are this way for us because we engage them from our hearts. Our concern is not for performance, but for words and actions done in response to God. Those are not in order to get something from him, but because of what he has already done in and for us. Such words and actions flow naturally and lovingly from hearts enlivened by the Holy Spirit. How might actions in your life of faith be better directed by the Holy Spirit's work in your heart? I think there's something to that. I think people respond differently in a faith setting. Sometimes it can feel a little too ritualistic, I guess, at sometimes, and you want it to feel more organic, but there is benefit in some of those rituals that kind of brings you back and centers you in what we're actually here for. Verse 34, no longer will they teach their neighbor to say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. This is one interpretation of this proposes that this verse looks to the time after Jesus' second coming, when our presence with God in heaven yields our fullest knowledge of him. Another interpretation proposes that Jeremiah's prediction contrasts the need for human mediators under the old covenant, the reference in the priests of the tribe of Levi, with the direct access to God that people have under the new covenant. Either way, the time of the new covenant will be an era when the people of God include more than the people of ancient Israel and Judah. Knowledge of God will spread to the peoples of all nations and languages. The people will not only have God's Spirit in their hearts to guide and instruct them, they will also be a forgiven people. The Lord promises to forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. This is the fresh start that the new covenant promises, beginning anew with a clean slate, not encumbered by the sins and the failures of the past. This brings back to mind the change indicated in Jeremiah 29 and 30 above. Not only will everyone be responsible for their own actions, but once forgiven, those sins will be remembered no more to condemn us or those who come after us. And when it talks about the knowledge, you think about what they had to go through to communicate with God in the past. For everyone to know God gives you that intimate relationship with God. There's no mediator there; it's you and Him. And this is where it switches from the Jeremiah text to it was John 1:17, I think. Yeah, John chapter 1, verse 17. In 17a, for the law was given through Moses. It says Moses experienced God's gracious favor, and the law that came through him was by the initiative of the gracious God. Yet the primary characteristic of the law of Moses is its commands, decrees, and ordinances. There was nothing inherently wrong with these, quite the opposite, but the passage of time proved humans to be incapable of keeping these 100% of the time. So the initial grace of the old covenant received through Moses as a mediator needed to be replaced by the grace of a new and superior covenant, the one about which Jeremiah speaks. So, you all have done Bible recap. You've read those decrees and commands. I would miss one a day. I would mess up one a day. So they're right when they say that there's, humans could not 100% adhere to that covenant. But it talks about the superior covenant, which leads to 17b, which is grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. The superior covenant is mediated by a far superior mediator, Jesus Christ. Now, we're not slighting Moses here. Moses was great, but who's a better mediator, Moses or Jesus Christ? When you're talking about the second covenant, it is through him. Through Jesus Christ, the word becomes flesh. And now think about, Paul's opening this morning, nobody comes to the Father except through me. And they're talking about Jesus Christ. And that really, that is the covenant, Compared to the law of Moses, his yoke is easy and his burden is light. Like our analysis of the word grace, to attribute the coming of truth to Jesus is to not deny that Moses received the truth. The truth Jesus brings is the truth regarding the new covenant. So it talks about this as a fresh start overall. It says, many Christians who read their Bibles faithfully struggle with understanding what to do with the commands and regulations they find in the Old Testament. Because we believe in the inspiration and the value of the entire Bible, we must take these passages seriously. The prophecy in Jeremiah 31 helps us put other portions of the Old Testament into perspective. The law of Moses revealed God's will for the people of Israel, and in doing so revealed many of the things about his nature and character. Jeremiah's perspective shows that this initial covenant did not work for Israel. This was not because God failed, but because of the people's disobedience. Eventually, Israel was punished by the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple, followed by exile. And this is just talking about Judah's timeline. By this time, the northern kingdom is gone. And they've already experienced some exiles, and it places this text right at the point to where the temple's been ransacked, and it's almost full destruction. So it's right at the end. The new covenant Jeremiah speaks of is a fresh start for humanity. This new covenant defines its adherents not in terms of obedience to law, but as those who have experienced the grace of being forgiven through Jesus' atonement for our sins. And that's where the love comes from. That's where it's love over fear is, if it's follow this to the letter of the law, you're going to make sure you do that, but that's it. When you realize that you've messed up, but you've gotten that forgiveness. We see that in human situations. When you've messed up and somebody forgives you, a lot of times it's a parental setting. It almost refreshes that relationship. It makes you want to go that extra mile because you've been given that grace. And that's, the example of what they're talking about here. It said, as new covenant people, we have much we can learn from the old covenant, but we rejoice in the reality of the new covenant. What the prophets searched for diligently, we now experience. And I think that too, when they talk about the prophets, you look at how far in advance the message was, and it was hard for them to wrap their head around because they're so focused on the now. You know, when you're talking about the Babylonian captivity and everything that's going on, they're focused on the now. They're not thinking, we have the ability to look back in 2020 hindsight, but I do like when you read the prophets' messages in the Old Testament and then tie it back to the New Testament, and you see how everything came full circle. This is probably as fast as I have taught in a long time, and I did have an energy drink before I walked up here. So I went a lot faster than I anticipated, because normally I'm pushing up against the clock. But so that's conclusion, but we have time for open discussion. We have a lot of time for open discussion. So if anybody else has anything. If Jeremiah is anybody's personal favorite, we can expound on it. If not, have a good week.